Greetings and welcome, I'm Ash, and this is my review for UnderRail. UnderRail is an isometric, as old school as it gets, turn-based combat RPG set in a post-apocalyptic future where the surface has been rendered uninhabitable and the remnants of the human population now live and wage war against each other in metro tunnels and caverns surrounding them. It features an in-depth character creation system with plenty of skills and perks to choose from, as well as a nice variety of options when it comes to dealing with problems. Everything from talking your way out of them to simply shooting the problem in the face. The freedom of choice when it comes to character building is both UnderRail's greatest strength and greatest weakness. On one hand, you can make some truly unique characters with interesting combat styles, but on the other hand, and especially if you're new to the game, you can screw yourself over in such ways that will only become apparent about 10 hours in. I played through the game with a psychic character that could absolutely annihilate any sentient being while was completely helpless against machines or those resistant to mental attacks. I managed to compensate for this massive flaw through trap making and chemistry, which gave me access to traps and bombs, but if I had taken any other crafting profession, my character of 20 plus hours would be either screwed or forced to do some really awkward pistol fighting in order to get through a couple of the later game encounters. However, had I chosen a guns and crossbow oriented character, I wouldn't have to worry about anything because there are plenty of different guns and bolts you can use to adapt to almost any situation. Not to mention that the stats that benefit them tend to be the same, whereas my psychic character's willpower does him very little when it actually comes to shooting a gun. Don't get me wrong though, I love the amount of choice you have, it's just that rookie CRPG players could completely ruin their playthrough before it even began. What I would do to remedy this is add pre-built classes you can choose from, while still keeping the customization option, so this way new players can start out in UnderRail with a balanced foundation from which they can further improve their character. While there are plenty of non-combat options and talents you can take, UnderRail is at its core a combat-focused RPG, so make sure you plan your build accordingly. The battles are done in turn-based fashion, and the system as a whole is well polished and allows for a lot of different approaches. Personally, it reminds me heavily of Fallout 2's battle system, what with all the different items, skills and weaponry you can employ against your rather tough enemies. And when I say tough, I don't mean that lightly. UnderRail is an incredibly hard game, even on normal difficulty, because the enemies are numerous, ruthless, and able to pull off the very same tricks as you can. In order to guarantee your survival, you will need to prepare for the battle ahead of time. If you know you're going to be fighting beasts that frequently use poison, then bringing a couple of antidotes will make your life a lot easier, whereas if you know you're going to be engaging a street gang, it's probably a good idea to ditch your sneaking outfit and put on some good old-fashioned Kevlar to stop yourself looking like Swiss cheese. Positioning is also crucial, as you want to leave each battle with a minimum health lost, given that healing items are both expensive and somewhat rare. What this meant for my psychic and trap-based character was constantly luring enemies around corners, where they would either step on a mine or some poison caltrops, allowing me to either fear them through the poison once again or simply focus them down one by one. Another nifty trick I learned is that animals aren't the best when it comes to operating doors and fences, so if I ever had to fight a pack of burrowers or any other such beastie, I would use the doors and fences as a way to either reset the fight if it goes south, or to simply shoot the bastards through it while they desperately try to claw at me. All of this might sound excessive, but as you progress through UnderRail, the enemies will become so hard to deal with that you will need to make sure you use every single advantage you can get your hands on in order to crush them. It is possible my build was simply underpowered, and that UnderRail isn't as hard as it seems, but given all of the abilities the enemies have later on, I highly doubt that. Despite looking like it, I am not actually complaining about this. On the contrary, I found the difficulty rather refreshing, because too often these days can you just completely break a game's balance by just leveling up a couple of times. UnderRail always keeps it just hard enough that it forces you to think outside the box, while never so hard that you will get frustrated with constant reloading. The interesting thing with combat is that despite it being the biggest part of the game, it will yield you no experience if you play under the recommended oddities experience system. Rather than gaining experience through the slaughter of everything and anything, the oddities system instead rewards you for exploration and finding unique items in the world. This might sound insignificant because the system just moves the EXP generation from one place to another, but in actual gameplay this means that talking your way out of problems, or even using stealth to completely avoid encounters, is a valid idea. During the early hours of my playthrough, I simply couldn't defeat robotic enemies with my mental abilities, so I resorted to sneaking around them, which involved skulking through the shadows, crawling through vents, and dodging cameras. It's very refreshing to be able to go through a game using all of your skills to their full effects and still feel like you're accomplishing something rather than simply getting underleveled due to lack of combat. Besides simply gaining experience, you will also find a ton of loot either on the corpses of your enemies or in the various lockers and chests, but the problem here is that most of the stuff you will find is related to crafting, and you can realistically only invest so many points into crafting, especially early on, before you gimp your character too much when it comes to combat. I only had 2 crafting disciplines, trap making and chemistry, but even those 2 were constantly kept slightly underleveled because I had to focus on my actual survival by picking more combat-oriented skills. In other words, you're going to be picking up a lot of junk that you can't use and can't sell because the merchants are only going to ever accept a couple of pieces at a time. So in the end, you will go through a lot of effort to sneak through abandoned camp for some loot, only to gain a measly 1 experience and a bunch of heavy crafting components for a profession you don't have and can't use. I would have preferred if there was more actual loot in the game, so I didn't have to rely on shops for all my armor and weaponry. The crafting system, on the other hand, is pretty clever and well done, allowing you to break down various components to their base elements and then combining those according to recipes to create items of interest. The system is about as realistic as it gets, so in order to create, let's say, poison caltrops, you would need your biology skill to extract the poison into a vial, and then use your mechanics skill to then sharpen those metal scraps into triangles, and then combining those would finally yield you caltrops. Crafting in UnderRail can be a fairly involved process that requires you to gather ingredients from all over the place in order to complete the recipe you're working on, but once you do manage to finish it, you'll get multiples of the item you crafted, making the whole thing feel quite satisfying because the payoff at the end is huge. Once crafted, the above mentioned caltrops will yield 10 sacks, which can last you a good few hours even with frequent use. Now that is value in crafting. Stylistically, UnderRail looks pretty good. Obviously, it doesn't compare to massive AAA games like The Witcher 3, but the art style is nicely done and rather unique among the RPGs these days. Most importantly, the darker tones present in every scene help reinforce the atmosphere of danger and decay, making the whole experience quite immersive. The one complaint I will level against UnderRail's graphics is that enemies in corners or tight areas are almost impossible to see. This can be easily fixed by giving enemies an outline when they are standing behind something, but as it stands right now, you'll have to do a lot of mousing around to figure out where the enemies are and how many of them are there. The music works in a similar fashion to the graphics, with a big focus on ambient noise, somber tones, and immersion building. While that works great when you're out exploring some dank and musky cave, it's a bit disappointing that the music doesn't kick up in tempo when you're in the middle of combat. Due to this issue, and even though it's fairly well done, I ended up muting it in favor of my own music. Lore-wise, I consider UnderRail's world incredibly interesting with all the different factions and monsters that popped up ever since the surface became uninhabitable. I spent a lot of time questioning anyone willing to talk to me about the history of the place, and for the most part I wasn't disappointed with the revelations or the quality of the writing. On the other hand, the main story was a bit lackluster. Not bad by any stretch, but a bit too generic considering how fascinating the world is. Another problem I had with it is that a lot of quests I undertook had very little personal engagement for me. I was simply out there doing an insanely difficult and dangerous job for someone with very minimal pay as a reward. Only in the middle to late game did I start becoming personally involved in things, though I won't talk about the specifics due to spoilers. I would say that the story in general was quite alright, but it was definitely the combat challenges, character advancement, and exploration opportunities that kept pushing me to go forward, despite my build encountering a lot of problems later on, rather than the urge to complete the missions. So what are my final thoughts on UnderRail? I would say that I enjoyed my time with UnderRail. It might be a bit clunky in some areas and require a far better tutorial for new players, but as a whole, it offers a deep level of customization with plenty of ways to approach any given situation and a very interesting world for you to explore. At its core, UnderRail is an old-school combat RPG, and as such comes with all of the positives and negatives of the genre itself. If you're someone that doesn't enjoy difficult turn-based combat or the need to optimize your character's build and equipment, then I would stay away from UnderRail. On the other hand, if you enjoyed the RPGs of old and love the idea of pitting your character against difficult encounters as you explore a world riddled with danger, you will find plenty of joy with UnderRail. Thank you guys for listening, and if you enjoyed this, please do leave a like, it ends up helping me a lot, and if you would like to see more, you can either subscribe here or visit the website link down below. That one tends to be updated more frequently. With all of that said, I hope you have a nice holiday, and I'll see you soon. See ya!